Skin tone. So we can normally look at our skin tone and kind of get a general idea of where we come from, like where our heritage, like, so my skin tone is white, and so that's pretty obvious that my heritage comes over, somewhere from Europe. That's where the, the English, came out of, um, is the, in the people that are English and, European and France and Germany, their skin tone is white. So obviously, Mayan heritage, or the majority of Mayan heritage, came from Europe. Um, and however, an interesting fact though is I can guarantee you, if I was to dig further, like further down the line, I'm probably going to find out that it's possible that I might, find out that, you know, I'm probably, 0.05% Indian, or, you know, 0.01%, African American. Now, I don't know that. I don't know that. I don't have that research here in front of me, but what I'm saying is that's the simple fact, that's the simple truth. Because you have your mother's side. And so let's say your mother's side is German. Um, if you did, if you dug a little more research, done a little more research, you're soon going to find out that there could have been somebody from that family tree would have gotten married to somebody from Italy. And so, therefore, the big bulk of where you come from is Germany, but a smaller proportion would have probably came from Italy, because somewhere down the line, you know, somebody from the Italian side probably would have gotten married to somebody from the German side. Um, you know, and so therefore, again, the big bulk would come from Germany, but there would still be a smaller bulk that came from Italy. And then if you again went further down the family tree, if you went down the Italian family tree, um, you're eventually going to come to, somebody, who has a heritage from France. And um, so now you have a big bulk that comes from German, a smaller bulk that comes from Italy, and yet a smaller bulk of a smaller percentage coming from France. And so if you kept on doing that, eventually, yeah, the percentage would be smaller and smaller and smaller. And so that is why I'm confident that each and one of us, each person from Africa, is, if they, kept following their DNA, I can guarantee you they're probably going to come across, you know, their inheritage, you know, in it might be a very, very small percentage, but I guarantee you that it might even be 0.0001% Caucasian. But I guarantee you on the flip side, you know, um, somebody that's Caucasian, somebody that is white, can possibly be 0.0000, 0.0001% African American. And that right there, because do you think that the Egyptians were just simply there, and like they just, like, obviously the Egyptians came from somewhere, and those people came from somewhere, and those people came from somewhere. um and it all points back to uh Abram and the people living, you know. So what I'm saying is, eventually we're going to come to Abram, and eventually we're going to come to Noah and his family. And so that's what this person that wrote this book traced, has done the research. Done the research finding where each um, person's, well, not each person's, each people group, so the Caucasians, like the Europeans, the people from Europe, where they came from, and where those people came from before their, you know, they emerged. And by doing so, and I haven't read the entire book, but by doing so, he has, you know, unlocked the mystery of where the um, American Indians came from. And so, but for the most part, you look at your skin tone and you can kind of guess where, for the majority, and you can kind of guess where we would have came from. And so, yes, people throughout time have looked at the skin tone of the Middle East, and because people that lived in the city of Ur, and the city of Ur was from the Middle East, there's some speculation that their skin tone would have been the same skin tone throughout the Middle East. But So for one, go back to what I just described. If it's true that you have one culture that arises from another and like back through history, rising up from one culture and that culture, rising up out of another culture, you kind of can't necessarily say that the the skin tone of the people in the Middle East were always Middle Eastern. Like you're making a claim saying that the skin tone of the people in the Middle East were always that kind of was like a some kind of shade of tan. Um, and well, not so, not so, because again, one you have cultures rising up and coming out of several different cultures before that. So to understand the skin tone to know the skin tone of the people that lived in the city in Abram's time, you have to understand the skin tone of Noah and his family. But then to understand their skin tone, you have to know the skin tone of the people before Noah's time. You have to understand what type of skin tone Adam and Eve were. Well, you technically cannot do that. We technically, well, I mean, if we read this book, obviously we might be able to. And so if we do the same research that this guy did, traced DNA, we might be able to. However, like that would be the only way. So besides like putting that aside, you it's really difficult to just come out and say, well, the the people living in were a certain skin tone. I mean, that's really hard to say when you don't really have any evidence of Noah and his family, like what kind of skin tone Noah and his family were. But then, since we don't have any evidence of that, you don't have any evidence of Adam and Eve's skin tone either. So, here's what I'm saying. There's a lot of people that suspect that Jesus would have been, like his skin tone would have been tan at the very least. And that's most likely, like I concede that. However, just because the Israelites come from the Middle East doesn't necessarily mean, and just because they have ties to Abram and Abram comes from Ur and Ur is in the Middle East, going back to what I just said, doesn't mean that the Israelites were, and doesn't mean that they are Middle Eastern. For starters, Israel, how many times did the Israelites intermarry? Well, to figure that out would have to take a lot of research. But we know that they intermarried with the Assyrians, they intermarried with the Babylonians, and there's a couple others that I'm not thinking of right now. The Persians, they intermarried with the people of Persia. They intermarried with the Egyptians, and the Egyptians, their skin tone was black. So, and they intermarried with the Egyptians. But then you get to, closer to Jesus's time when they, were obviously possibly could have been intermarrying with who? The Romans. So you have the Egyptians, their skin tone was dark, was very dark. Their skin tone would have been black. But then you get closer to Jesus being born. They intermarried with the Romans, and the Romans are Caucasian. The Romans are white. Their skin tone is white. But again, you have many different, from Israel, you have different times that they intermarried, and they intermarried with, different cultures, and these different cultures had a different, skin tone. So, number one, even if we knew Abram's skin tone, by the time we get to Jesus, we don't really, we can speculate from the evidence, but we don't really know. But now let's take a look at what this book says. And so this is my second point. Is this right here. DNA sequences change from generation to generation. So what the author of this book traced has found out in his study is that the DNA sequences change from generation to generation, which makes it even more difficult. Which makes it more difficult to figure out what skin tone Abram and his family was. Was it Caucasian? Was it dark? Was it tan? What kind of shade of tan? What kind of shade of Caucasian? What kind of shade of, dark? Um, like, we don't know. Because the DNA sequence changes from one generation to the next. So it changes from generation to generation. So eventually, you're going to come out with a people who have different skin tones. So you start with Adam and Eve. Their skin tone, unknown. We don't know the skin tone of Adam and Eve. It doesn't matter if they came from Africa, if they came from the Middle East, or they came from Asia, or even if they came from Australia. We don't know the skin tone of Adam and Eve. Just because they come from Africa doesn't mean that they were just dark skinned, you know. What if they came from America? Does that mean their skin tone was red? Because most of the Indians' skin tone it is red. So, you can't say that just because Adam and Eve came from here or here or here, that their skin tone was that color. I mean, they were the first humans to ever live. They were the first humans created by God. So it doesn't really matter what type of skin tone God created Adam and Eve. By the time we get to Noah, the planet would have been a various, the skin tones of the entire planet, like in people groups, would have been brown, black, tan, white, pale, you name it. Because why? The DNA sequence changes from generation to generation. And when going back to what I started with, when you look at your skin tone, our skin tone is a certain color based on the DNA. So my DNA comes from Europe based on my skin tone. So going back to the DNA sequences changing from one generation to the next, DNA sequences changing from generation to generation, that tells us something. That tells us that, yes, also the skin tone is going to change, right? Like it's also, like eventually the skin tone is going to change. So you can almost imagine, let's theoretically And please understand what theoretically means. It means that there's no evidence of this. It's just, something that we're saying at the moment. Theoretically speaking, let's just say that Adam and Eve's skin tone was white. They have children. Obviously, their skin tone is not going to change. There's not going to be much change in the DNA, but their children have a slightly different DNA than Adam and Eve. And so you get through the generations, eventually, once you go through enough generations, you can kind of expect once you get to Noah's time, you can kind of expect some, differences in the skin tone because of the DNA, because skin tone is linked to DNA. So you can kind of, because once you go from Adam and Eve to the days of Noah, the DNA sequences have changed throughout the generations. You can kind of expect that some of the skin tone would have eventually changed through the generations as well. Not all at once, but once you get to the days of Noah, you can kind of expect that there would have been some people with a darker skin tone and some people with a lighter skin tone. So then you go from Noah and his family, and because the earth would have got wiped out, humanity would have gotten wiped out. The only family that would have survived the flood would have been Noah and his family. So then you start all over. And you have, like, his 3 sons. It says that the Bible states that the people groups began from his 3 sons, like Noah's 3 sons. And so, again, because the DNA and because skin tone is linked to DNA, by the time you get to Abram in the land of Ur, well, what do we know? DNA sequences change from generation to generation. And so if skin tone is linked to DNA, well, eventually, you go from Noah getting off the ark, having, repopulate the earth, and you get to Abram and his family from Ur. So, and if the DNA sequences change from generation to generation, who can say what type of skin tone Abram and his family had? And if you can't give an answer to that, good luck trying to answer or trying to prove what type of skin tone Jesus had. In order to do that, you would have to do the same research that this guy did. You would have to trace the DNA from the different, so you would have to start, let's say, Africa. You would have to start in Africa. You would have to start in Egypt. You would have to start at the Egyptians or with the Egyptians. And you would have to trace them back to a people before them. Then you would have to keep going. You would have to continue to trace their heritage, all the way back to until you got to Abram and the city of Ur and those people. Like you can't just, like, that is how, like, you'd have to trace back the DNA. You'd have to trace the DNA from the Egyptians all the way back to the people that lived in Ur. But then, so if you, let's say you chose to start in Greece, and we know Greece is another Caucasian, like from Europe, before the Romans. So obviously they're white. You'd have to trace their heritage back to people that were there before they were. And then you would have to continue to go back and go back and go back until you came to the people living in Ur. However, just because you are able to do that doesn't necessarily, now, yeah, you're gonna be able to, then, have a better understanding of what type of skin tone, they were. So I can expect you would be somewhere from 60% to maybe 90%, like maybe 60 to 90%, correct, or, but there's going to be room, there's still going to be plenty of room where you could be, misled, or, maybe, so there would be a lot more research to do. And so again, it's just very, very, like, other than taking the time and finding the heritage by looking at the person's DNA, just like the person that wrote this book did, how can you sit there and tell people that Jesus was X, Y, and Z, like this type of skin tone or that type of skin tone? Again, we have a best estimated guess based on research, but what research? Is the research based on the DNA? Based on DNA, like going back into time to connect the dots through DNA? Or are you basing your research off of, well, Abram came from Ur, and Ur is in the Middle East, therefore, well, they must have been Middle Eastern. Okay, well, hold on a second. I don't believe that the Middle Eastern people always just existed. I mean, there would have been people there, like, go back to what I was saying. Like, Noah and his family existed before the people living in Ur. So you can't just be like, oh, well, Ur is in the Middle East and Abram came from Ur, therefore is just middle. Like, nope. Nope. Wrong. Wrong. Wrong, wrong, wrong. You can't do that. You gotta follow what this, like this person that wrote this book, he's already done the research. He has searched people's DNA. He has looked at the DNA of the Indians and several different, DNAs, and has connected the Indians to a people group before there were Indians in America. So, where did the Indians come from? I don't know because I didn't get that far, but I'm assuming that as I read, I'm going to find out where, like, what culture the Indians came out of before they began in the Americas. So, anyways, that's the study. That's kind of what I wanted to go over and talk about. Obviously, you have to come to an understanding that it takes a lot more research, or it's going to take a lot more research to find out the skin tone of the people that lived in Ur during Abram's time. And so this video is hopefully will get, some people a good idea, a good vision, obviously get people to think, well, I guess just because Abram came from the land of Ur and Ur came from the Middle East doesn't really hold evidence that Abram's skin tone was the same skin tone of the people living in Middle East today.